Annie Oakley was born on August 13th, 1860 in Ohio. And Annie's early years were no walk in the park. I mean, you try being born in the 1800s. Her dad passed away when she was just 6 years old, leaving her mom alone with 6 kids to look after. Oh my God, like Calamity. The family finances were always extremely tight, and Annie's mom remarried and had another baby, but then this husband also died a year or two later. So now Annie's mom was back on her own with 6 kids and a newborn. So when she was about 8, Annie went to live at a house for orphans, the elderly, and the mentally ill. This sounds rough, but it actually gave Annie the chance to get an education. While she was there, she would learn to sew, which would help her out later in her life. When she was about 13, Annie went back to live with her mother and siblings. And by now, her mom was on her 3rd husband. So the family finances, I guess, were a little bit more stable, but they were still very poor. Annie would take her dad's old Kentucky rifle out and hunt for rabbits and birds. And she got pretty good at it. I mean, to the point where she was hunting small animals for the local grocery store. The animals Annie shot were then resold to hotels and restaurants all the way over in Cincinnati. Now, this eventually made Annie enough money to be able to pay the $200 mortgage on her mom's house when she was just 15. Annie was just naturally gifted at shooting. And she apparently said, quote, "When it felt right, I just pulled the trigger." Wow. Yeah. So Annie is making some good money. So she decides to enter into a shooting competition in Cincinnati. And while she's there, she goes up against this guy named Frank E. Butler. Frank was, I guess, a pretty big deal. He was a marksman who performed in a lot of Wild West variety shows. It's kind of like the circus, but with guns and cowboys. Anyway, during the competition, Annie hits all 25 targets. And Frank, he missed 1, which made Annie the winner. Frank was so impressed that he ended up asking her out, and they started dating. And the next year, in 1876, they got married. Aww. Annie and Frank start touring around the country, performing in shows and shooting all kinds of things. And at first, Annie just acted as Frank's assistant. I know, even though she was technically the better shooter. But then Frank's partner gets sick, so Annie steps in and finally gets her time in the spotlight. From the moment Annie joined Frank's act and started performing next to him in the vaudeville circuit, people just loved her. She was known for being kind, professional, humble, and honestly, insanely talented with a gun. She even got the nickname Little Sure Shot from Sitting Bull, who was a legendary Native American tribal leader. Annie set herself apart from the rest of the other female shooters at the time. So instead of wearing skimpy, flashy outfits, which was the norm, Annie dressed pretty conservatively and made all of her own costumes. Annie said this was because she didn't want anything to distract from her shooting skills. These outfits didn't show much skin, but they were really cute. Cowgirl chic. Okay, so in 1884, Annie starts touring with Frank in the Sells Brothers Circus. After a year, they get an amazing offer to join the biggest show at the time, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Now, this was huge. Buffalo Bill was the #1 marksman at the time, and his show toured all over the world and in front of important people, like celebrities and even the president. It was so popular that in 1893 alone, 3 million people went to the spectacle. In the Buffalo Bill show, Frank and Annie started out as performing partners. But as more people see just how talented Annie is, her fame starts to take over. Now, thankfully, rarely do you hear this, but Annie's husband Frank wasn't threatened by this. He sees how talented she is. I mean, that's why he asked her out in the first place. So he takes a step back and decides to become Annie's manager/assistant. So supportive. Love to see that, huh? And overnight, Annie becomes the star of the Buffalo Bill show. It was her name on the posters, advertised as Champion Markswoman. Basically, Frank would only come on stage so Annie could shoot cigarettes out of his mouth. Yeah, that's love right there. Annie also shot glass balls out of the air, and she could split a playing card in half, like the skinny half. like paper thin, from over 30 feet away. She could also snuff out candles with the wind from her bullets and shoot the corks off of wine bottles. Hot. Annie performed her stunts in Spain, Italy, France, and even for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in England. Apparently, the Queen called Annie, quote, "a very clever little girl." Okay, thanks. Like, way to downplay it. Very clever little girl. All right, cool. And everywhere Annie went, she proved that women were totally capable of not only handling firearms, but outshooting men. She was really passionate about encouraging women to learn how to use pistols, which were smaller and could be kept in their purses for self-defense. Annie once said, quote, "I would like to see every woman know how to handle guns as naturally as they know how to handle babies," end quote. Annie spent 17 years with the Buffalo Bill Show before she retired in 1901. And then something wild happened. Annie found herself in an insane legal battle.